Hi, everyone. Guess who's here with me today? It's Priscilla Mendenhall, another one of the founders' messages for you members and non-members who have joined us this year at our Congress. Welcome, Priscilla. I'm so happy to have you and that you made time to share some of the impetus behind the creation of NCIHC. I've already spoken to a couple of other members, and I remind people who are watching this that at the time, I can't imagine how isolated everyone must have felt in their respective states and regions trying to do this battle. It was before email and internet, and what it must have felt like to get in a room with like-minded people who are all pushing against similar obstacles and sharing your workarounds with each other and sharing what you thought was fundamentally important as to the best way to deliver language access services to communities whose language or whose first language was not English. So thank you very much for being with us today. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself to the newer ones, the younger ones among us, so they have a real good feel for who you are before we get into the interview.
Well, thank you, Eliana, and hello to the not younger ones, to the folks that I do remember well with all my heart, and thinking back on those years as you described them, and a hello to the newer ones who continue doing the work. All my gratitude, really. In terms of an introduction of myself, what I would say is my father was Foreign Service, the U.S. State Department. So I lived abroad a lot when I was young, and I was the person who didn't speak the language of the country. So that meant that from a very early age, I was 7 when we first went abroad, I became aware of language differences and of navigating those differences. And I think that's really carried through. I did learn French and speak it fluently, write it terribly, and then later learned really bad Italian. But I was still, in the habit of being a language minority, and then, in those contexts. And then when I did move back to the United States, I married Southeast Asian and spent a lot of time in his community, where again, I would be in someone's house and all the women would be in the kitchen and we'd be cooking. And I knew they were gossiping about me, but I had no idea what they were saying, and they were wonderful and taught me a lot, but I knew what it was like to be kind of othered for that. So I think that was some of what brought me to this work. I will get into it when I answer the questions, but I became very aware of health access issues also as a child living abroad and seeing what people didn't have available to them. Otherwise, in terms of introductions, I would just say I moved slowly into language access from a background doing cultural competence work. And in 1997, I became the director of cultural competence and language access programs at the Northern Virginia Area Health Education Center. And that was when I started to connect with everybody in the NCIHC movement, if you want. And from then it was a decade of pretty extraordinary work, particularly because I was in Washington at the time, just outside of Washington, where a lot was happening at the federal level that was very important. And I got to be pulled into some of that.
So exciting. So can you talk about a couple, like say 3 items that propelled you on this path towards linguistic equities? And
Sure. Yeah. The first, I thought a lot about this when I was thinking about how I wanted to talk to everyone. And the first was really an experience that I had living in Laos as a young teenager. And my sister and I had a community of Lao folks that we spent time with. And one of our friends was on his motorcycle with another friend riding to our house, and they got into a head-on collision with a truck. And he was, fatally injured, but we went to see him at the hospital that night, and he basically bled out in front of us. And the friend who was in the back of the motorbike he had an eye injury. And once we got to my parents, my dad was able to get him on a transport to a US Air Force base in Thailand, and saved his eye and his life. So at that point for me, and this is a story I tell not in any way to, say anything about me, but for me, access to healthcare became very evident that in that time, that my friend was there in a Lao hospital, there were no blood transfusions, nothing. And the other friend was shipped off to an American Air Force base that had no business being in Thailand, but that's another story. And he was saved. So I was 14. And I think that that particular experience at a young age really kind of put me on a path that I wasn't aware of at the time. And I traveled a lot of different paths between that time and later, when I finally moved into the field. So if you want me to continue, I'll just segue.
I do.
Yes. I tell this in stories because that's how I've always explained my journey. 20 years later, fast forwarding 20 years later, I was, as I said, back kind of living in DC. I had married someone from Laos. We spent a lot of time at the Laotian temple. He and I, he was a news cameraman, very good photographer, and he and I were doing a documentary about the Laotian community outside of DC, focused on the abbot of the temple, who was a traditional healer. And I became a familiar person at the temple, and I spent a lot of time with the abbot. In the course of that, I met a Laotian woman who became my friend. She was she was from the way far north of Laos, so she had been displaced multiple times. She was an extraordinary weaver, had lots of kids, was living here with her husband and the extended family. Anyway, so we became friends. And one day, her husband called my spouse and said that she had been hospitalized. So I went over to what was then the biggest county hospital in the area in Arlington County, which is a big jurisdiction right outside of DC, fairly well resourced. And I went in to see her, and she looked terrible. And some health providers came in and they were just yelling at her in English. There was no interpretation, nothing for her to understand what was happening. I learned that she was in liver failure because she had hepatitis B, which is endemic in the Lao community. And they had given her a few months to live. I really hadn't thought about interpreter services. I hadn't thought about that particular piece of things. But again, it was one of those transformational moments. As it turned out, her husband actually just took her out of the hospital. They went to see the abbot of the temple, and he said, "Oh, I know what's wrong. Here's your diet. Here's what you eat. Here's what you don't eat. Here's what you do and don't do." She lived for probably 20 years after that.
Wow.
So for me, that was that moment where I was in a big hospital. And I remember in this was like the late 80s. As you said, nothing was going on. Well, as you said, we were isolated, but in our part of the East Coast, nothing was happening around language access. Nada, zero, zip. So I began working with the Indo-Chinese Community Center. We were doing cultural competence activities there. And in the course, this is my third kind of movement in. As I was doing that, I happened to meet Julia Puebla Forte. And Julia was at the time in Senator Waxman's office. She had pretty much authored the bilingual bicultural service demonstration projects. She was also then beginning to be involved in NCIHC, as I remember, and my memory's a little fuzzy now. But she and I lived on the Hill. She was working on the Hill. We used to meet, and she became my mentor. She became the person who said, we need to get this going here in the DMV, in the district, and Maryland and Virginia. This needs to happen. So we talked a lot, and she just taught me everything she knew, and she invited me to the first public comment session on the class standards. And then it just then morphed into my position at AHEC, where when I was asked if I wanted that position, and what I would do in the position, because actually the AHEC had $200,000 that they had to spend down in 2 months because it was the end of the federal fiscal year. I said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do cultural competence, but we're going to do language access. And that was how it all began. That was the beginning of
Can
something.
you remind me about what year it was that your Laotian friend was hospitalized and there was no interpreting being offered at the hospital?
It was probably the year I was born and my daughter was born, because I had hoped that my friend could be her babysitter and be, we would have like an extended family babysitting arrangement. It was 1988, 89.
Wow, that's pretty far in, because I was
hired
as an interpreter at Rhode Island Hospital in 1980 after I graduated from the university up the hill on university. And that was all, there was no testing, vetting, language proficiency or anything. I had a degree in language, that was enough. And I remember getting together with the interpreters at Rhode Island Hospital and are trying to decide, no, we're not going to use kids, even if it's a language. And things that later became codified, that it's so gratifying when I moved to find some of my old notebooks and see that we had also come to very similar conclusions within our little cluster of 3 interpreters for the entire medical center. It's like, no, that's a good idea. They had a list of employees that self-identified as speaking another language well. When we went back and re-interviewed everybody on the list, asking, would you feel comfortable talking about this? Would you feel comfortable talking about that? Do you know the words for this? Do you know? And that list shrank considerably. But that's what you had to do, because there was no Polish interpreter. There was no
absolutely. And that was definitely the case for us, but it was a decade later, literally, that those conversations started to happen. Having said that, I think that at the time in the late 80s that Children's Hospital had a Spanish language interpreter service of some kind, but I could be wrong about that, because I remember training their interpreters like 10 years later. So the hospitals in Virginia,
children's hospitals across the country tend to do this, which is offer language access better than their sister hospitals, because they're forced to. The parent has to understand what's happening.
Exactly.
To be able to care for the child after that serious surgery or after that transplant, and protocols have to be understood to be followed. So they understood right away to cut to the chase and get results that are positive for the patient. You need to have language access.
No, absolutely. But and this is true everywhere, but I think back to those times and the pushback. And I mean, we would have conferences and people would walk out. I mean, major health department directors would leave the room, because we were implying that we had to test and train their staff. And then a year later, come back and say, oh, you were right. And I'm like, yeah, I know we were right, but that's not.
And it was very difficult to find somebody on the admin side or even on the physician side to champion for us. I mean, if every hospital had somebody like Dr. Eric Hart or Dr. Robert Putch, it would be a different story, because when doctors say, hey, I don't care how much it costs, I need that X-ray machine, I need that MRI, they find ways to pay for it. So if the same doctor were to say, hey, I can't treat, X percentage of my patients like a doctor, I have to treat them like a veterinarian. I need the tool, which is an interpreter. It will help move things along. So anyone out there who's a physician, become a stakeholder, sit at the table, help us be our voice.
Absolutely. And we did a big push around here to get some of the doctors in each of the hospitals to come on board. And that was certainly helpful as we built out, when I was at AHEC, what we ended up doing was creating our own training curriculum that really focused more on refugee communities where there were ethical issues that were different. And remembering that, we had contractors. No one was hiring staff interpreters. That was 10 years later than when we began. So we created a curriculum, and then we trained a lot of interpreters, but we were also marketing our own interpreter service to the hospitals. So it was a combination of lots of different pieces of that puzzle. And when I look back on it, it was phenomenal work. And it is, at this point, it makes me sad that a lot of the hospitals around here have just turned to telephonic completely, and I'm not disparaging telephonic. I think it has a great place, but
it shouldn't be the only choice.
Exactly. So it's been a rough and good journey. That's what I can say.
Yeah. I think we need more advocates at the table that have a little bit bigger sway than interpreter services department or community outreach department, or even patient complaints, customer service. We need a physician to say, hey, this is not right. We need to be able to offer all the modalities.
Exactly. And the other thing I would say too is that, in the beginning, and it was true for a number of years, the focus was so much on Spanish because the population obviously is so much bigger. But I remember kind of one of my roles, as I saw it then, was to advocate for refugee communities, much smaller, languages of lesser diffusion, and that could be a very lively conversation at NCIHC meetings, and I think it ended up being great, but it meant that, the Hmong community in Minnesota and everybody had to come in and be in this together. And it was challenging, obviously, because when you're in, working with a small community, in smaller places, the interpreters know everybody in the community. So then how do you bridge those ethical issues? But we managed to figure out some ways of doing things that professionalized what they were doing and had the community understand that role. So that was one of the particular challenges I think I and some others waded into in the early days of the council.
And we're so glad you did. And you may be interested in knowing that the current edition, that the journal, NCIHC's journal, it comes out once a year, issue 3 is focused exclusively on rare languages, or the LLD, languages of diffusion, not just to identify them, but also for best practice.
Right.
Define training. How do you assess? What do you do when there is only 1 or 2 interpreters for a particular language, and one of them really lacks the training needed?
Exactly.
This is pushed towards certification, and thank goodness CCHI has the core to at least assess basic knowledge of our health system.
Sure.
How good are they in their own language is a tough one,
hard.
tough nut to crack. So
indeed,
they're exploring that, and I look forward to seeing that publication, just like I enjoyed our conversation here today. So I thank you very much for making time.
I appreciate it.
No longer need to. But it is so appreciated, because we need to know the battles that were fought early on to take heart and keep pushing that envelope.
Yes, I absolutely. And can I have one more second to just add a thought that occurs to me? As people are looking at the languages of lesser diffusion, one thing that I've come up against in more recent years is the issue of particularly Indigenous Central Americans and Mexicans, for whom Spanish is a second language and their Spanish isn't great. And so then having the conversation about, well, what is your first language? Navigating that difficult conversation for them because of trauma, and then figuring out how to find, interpreters who can work in that second language and bridge the barrier, the kind of even political barriers that are within those little small communities. And I faced that repeatedly in working with the migrant community in Virginia when I lived there. And it was very challenging. It takes a lot of trust building to have, a Mayan speaker of whichever language say, I speak this language, you know, and
So much of it is how you ask the question. When we
right,
shifted from saying, do you speak English?
mm,
Which right away
right,
people are like, yeah,
exactly, right,
because if I say no, you're going to turn me away, to
right,
language would you prefer to learn and understand about your health condition? Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I have an option. Well, if I have an option, I'd really prefer Spanish or Portuguese or
hmm
Somali,
hmm
so that I can talk about it with my family because it was
right.
asked in a very different way.
Sure, exactly, exactly. And then just making sure that the patient actually, and this is against some of the protocols, but knows who the interpreter is going to be. Because if they don't trust that person because they know the family and there's been issues, you can't get there. It's just not going to happen. So those are nuances, but I think increasingly they're important for the work.
Yep, as we grow increasingly more diverse, despite efforts to stop that diversity, it's inevitable, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anyana.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks.